Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is St. Louis on the Air.
So to be an abolitionist in the 1830s was to invite a whole lot of trouble. Was to be seen as a radical, to be seen as crazy, to be seen as fanatical and dangerous. And even in the North, mobs set upon abolitionists. They broke up meetings. They attacked abolitionist lecturers where they appeared in churches or meeting halls, and harassed them. And so to be an abolitionist in the 1830s was really quite brave. It was quite courageous.
I'm Sarah Fensky. Journalist Ken Ellingwood's gripping new book is a biography of a man shaped by St. Louis and martyred by an angry mob in Alton. It's the story of Elijah Lovejoy, who became a passionate abolitionist fighting to end slavery by printing the truth as he saw it, and his neighbors didn't want to hear it. And through that work, he became, in 1837, the first American journalist slain for his work. The book is titled First to Fall, Elijah Lovejoy and the Fight for a Free Press in the Age of Slavery. And joining us today is its author, Ken Ellingwood. Ken, welcome.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
So, Ken, Elijah Lovejoy was trained as a minister, not a newspaper editor. What brought him from Maine to St. Louis?
He was sort of a restless soul in Maine. He had been a top student at what was called Waterville College, which is now Colby College in Waterville, Maine, and wanted to go where he could, find his fortune, find his mission. He was raised in a religious family and listened to a lot of religious professors at Waterville College, and got this notion that going west would be a place where he could, perform God's work and also his own, seek his own way. He didn't quite know what he would do out west, but he set out and he walked for much of the trip out to the Midwest, or what we now call the Midwest, which was then really the frontier. He arrived in St. Louis in the late 1820s, and he was first running a school and then turned to newspapering, but a fairly conventional newspaper from the time. The newspapers at the time were very partisan, they were very political, and his newspaper was a newspaper that favored the Whig Party. But at the time, he was still not terribly interested in slavery as an issue. He was more interested in classic Whig versus Democrat politics, and he used his newspaper for that purpose initially.
So how did his beliefs about slavery change during the years that he lived in St. Louis?
He became religious, and that was a key link in his development as an abolitionist. At the time of the 1830s, there was a very powerful religious movement known as the Second Great Awakening, and it was happening all over the United States. It was an evangelical flowering, if you will, a time when a lot of revival meetings were taking place. And there was a change in the air in terms of Christianity. The old ideas of Calvinism, predestination, were giving way to this new notion that a person had something to say, something to do in terms of bringing about his or her own salvation. And fighting sin, including the national sin of slavery, became a cause of a lot of evangelicals of the time. And Lovejoy was no different. He got into the anti-slavery movement primarily through his religion. He went to Princeton Theological Seminary after a couple of years as a newspaper editor in St. Louis. He became a minister, and then he moved back to the frontier, back to St. Louis, with a twin mission. He was going to be a minister, but he was also asked to edit a religious newspaper, and that was called the St. Louis Observer. And it was that newspaper that became his vehicle for writing about all kinds of views that he had. And one of the issues that became more and more important to Lovejoy as time went on was the issue of slavery. And I think one of the things that affected him very deeply was what he saw happening around him in Missouri and in St. Louis, where steamboats were headed south down the Mississippi River, carrying slaves into the South. Mm-hmm. And there were slaves around him in St. Louis. There was very abusive treatment of enslaved people around him in St. Louis, and in Missouri in general, and he was deeply affected by that. But Lovejoy wasn't a fire-breathing abolitionist from the start. He was really an accommodationist. He favored a gradual form of emancipation. He looked down on many of the more militant abolitionists back east, like William Lloyd Garrison. But as time went on, his views changed, and he became more radicalized with more time along the frontier, and more radicalized as he became a target of those pro-slavery forces that wanted him to stop publishing about slavery.
So the abolitionists, this is something that I was not fully aware of until going in depth in your book. And you did such a good job of sort of helping us understand these various factions. I'd always thought of them as just being against slavery. At the time, this was a much more loaded label. As you say, this was considered a pretty radical group. And even a lot of people who would have claimed that they were anti-slavery would not have been willing to consider themselves an abolitionist.
Yeah, that's very true, and I learned a lot more about it in doing the book. People after the fact, everybody's an abolitionist, right? Everybody's against slavery, but of course that wasn't true. In the 1830s, we're still very early in what we would call an organized abolition movement. It was a very radical thing at the time to be an abolitionist. That is. And it meant different things to different people. Some people were in favor of immediate emancipation, freeing the slaves, no compensation to owners, and even favoring equal rights with whites. That was a view held by people like Garrison in Boston. Lovejoy was not in that crowd. He was very slow to embrace the term abolition. He repeatedly denied that he was an abolitionist for years and said no. He favored a more moderate or gradual course toward eventually reaching freedom for slaves, but he was very accommodating towards slave owners in his early years. He believed that slave owners really had to be the ones who made that decision on their own. That the slave states had the rights to decide whether or not slavery existed in their jurisdictions. Mm. And so to be an abolitionist in the 1830s was to invite a whole lot of trouble. And that included being in the North. We have this idea that in the North everybody was against slavery and supported emancipation. In the South it was quite different. Well, that's not really true. I mean, in the North there was a great deal of support at least for maintaining this delicate marriage between North and South, which depended, in great part on the idea that the Southern states could pursue their own fate and pursue their own treatment of slavery. And to be an abolitionist, even in the North, was often to invite hatred, was to be seen as a radical, to be seen as crazy, to be seen as fanatical and dangerous. And even in the North, mobs set upon abolitionists. They broke up meetings. They attacked abolitionist lecturers where they appeared in churches or meeting halls, and harassed them. And so to be an abolitionist in the 1830s was really quite brave. It was quite courageous.
You had just such interesting passages in this book writing about these people that were going after the abolitionists. You write that anti-abolitionists, quote, saw themselves as enforcers of the majority's will during a time of flux, and that they saw the use of violence against anti-slavery activists, quote, as a form of nuisance abatement to maintain the community's living standards. And so up north, you have these abolitionists being harassed. This took an even more severe, I'm missing a word here, in the South. Basically, they were trying to censor any talk of any of this. And it was fascinating to hear about some of the laws that were passed. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it was one of the things, Sarah, that I was most surprised about when I really dug into this story. I initially started focusing on Lovejoy, and then, of course, I kind of zoomed out wider and wider to see what was the context in which he lived and in which he was trying to publish this newspaper. And I realized, well, he wasn't alone. He wasn't the only newspaper editor who was opposed to slavery and who was, facing the problem of mobs. But as I sort of panned even wider, what emerged was surprising to me, and I think it would shock a lot of Americans today to learn the degree to which the South and slavery forces in the South, but also with their allies in the North, attempted to essentially smother all criticism of slavery, to smother any debate about slavery. And that took a formal shape in the way of laws that were passed in the South against printing, publishing, anything that could be seen as being quote-unquote incendiary, that could be seen as promoting quote-unquote servile insurrection, that is, anything that might encourage enslaved people to rise up against their enslavers, and even to the U.S. Congress, where the House of Representatives passed a rule known as the Gag Rule in the 1830s that prevented any discussion of slavery in the halls of Congress. That was, it's just stunning to consider the degree to which the United States in this era was essentially prevented from discussing the most fundamental flaw that it contained, which is the enslavement of a whole class of people. The suppression regime, as I call it in the book, extended, to the postal system, where postmasters were seizing bags full of abolitionist literature and journals that were being mailed into the South, and just seizing bags of mail and burning them, not letting them reach people. So it was a multifaceted campaign to prevent, talk of slavery, and that took a more informal shape in the North, in particular, with violent mobs that just acted to try to prevent people like Lovejoy from raising the issue of slavery in public.
And so this is the context that Elijah Lovejoy, he's there in a slave state in Missouri, publishing this newspaper that was increasingly, vehemently, publicly anti-slavery, and even then finally crosses over the line, I think, to become an abolitionist newspaper. Ken, I think it's safe to say he was hounded out of St. Louis. Would you characterize it that way?
Absolutely, he was hounded out of St. Louis. I mean, he as his columns became more and more daring, more and more strident in criticizing slavery. And it was visible to everybody around him. It was visible to his neighbors. It was visible to others in St. Louis and elsewhere in Missouri that this guy was crossing the line. He was threatening their business ties with the deeper South. He was threatening to, upset the sort of stability of life there by injecting this discussion of slavery into the community. And increasingly, people were, whispering and talking about what are we going to do with this guy? They tried to shut his newspaper down more than once in St. Louis. And eventually, he finally decided that he would leave. But the, sort of crowning farewell to him was that a mob attacked his newspaper office and, threw all of his belongings into the river, and he was able to salvage his press and get it across the river to Alton in Illinois. But he was chased out of St. Louis, and there's no question about that. He was harassed for months and threatened. And he had a wife and a small child, and he was quite worried about what would happen to all of them.
We need to take a quick break, but we'll be back shortly to continue this conversation with Ken. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. Welcome back. My guest today is Ken Ellingwood. His new book is First to Fall, Elijah Lovejoy and the Fight for a Free Press in the Age of Slavery. This is just a terrific book. And Elijah Lovejoy, hounded out of St. Louis, ends up in Alton. Ken, Alton ultimately didn't offer any greater protection than Missouri did for what Elijah Lovejoy was trying to do. Was that in part his fault? Could he have maybe finessed the situation now that he was no longer within a slave state?
Well, I think he thought he was going to finesse the situation a little bit better than happened. Illinois at the time was a free state, right? So he was going ostensibly to a place where he would be free to talk about slavery, but as he put it at the time to people who were in Alton, wondering kind of with a bit of skepticism or even suspicion about his motives, what are you doing here? He believed that why does he doesn't really need to talk about slavery so much in Illinois because it's a free state and it's no longer around him, and he tried to put people at ease by saying, I don't have as much need to talk about slavery, so relax, I'm not going to bring trouble here. Some people believe that he was telling them, making a promise to them, that he wouldn't write about slavery in his newspaper. He insisted, and his friends insisted, that he never made such a promise. He never said that he would keep the newspaper clear of any talk of slavery. And he, as he got established, as he grew his newspaper in Alton and found more subscribers there, he over the next year, where his life would eventually end, over the first period of months, he slowly began to talk more and more about slavery. Mm-hmm. Could he have stayed quiet? He could have, but that wasn't really Lovejoy. He was a person who spoke his mind. He was self-certain to a fault. He was a scolding presence. He was somebody who saw something that he thought was wrong, and he piped up about it. Whether that was about not observing the Sabbath as the way the Bible instructed, or whether it was drinking alcohol, or whether it was slavery. And he found himself in much the same position in Alton as he had in St. Louis, which is with a lot of people around him wishing he would just shut up, and he did not.
You have a great scene in this book where he faces down this angry group of business leaders in Alton who wanted to strip him of his newspaper. He has so many wonderful things he says in this speech. He says, I do not admit that it is the business of this assembly to decide whether I shall or shall not publish a newspaper in the city. I have a right to do it. What I wish to know is whether you will protect me in the exercise of this right. They did not do that. And he kind of saw this coming. He said, the contest has commenced here, and here it must be finished. If I fall, my grave shall be made in Alton. By refusing to give up, was he basically signing his death warrant?
I think he was ready. I think he had been ready. In his letters to his relatives back in Maine, even a year earlier, he referred to the possibility that he could die in his opposition to slavery. And so I think by the time he made this speech that you just referred to, which was truly a very gripping scene, very close to the end of his failed battle against the pro-slavery forces, he was accepting the reality that by continuing to insist on publishing the newspaper. This is after mobs had destroyed his press in Alton several times. I think he was aware that this was, going to be a fight to the death, and he was prepared to make it. And the other thing that's very telling about that speech that you just referred to and read some from is that initially he started off as a preacher, and he was talking about slavery and moral sin and all of that. As the time went on, he became much more, or I should say equally, an opponent of any attempts to curb freedom of the press. So just as much as he was an abolitionist, he became equally a very strong advocate for freedom of the press, to the point where the two causes became, entwined. They became the same cause, really. It was a cause of liberty, and there was very little difference between them in his mind. And he was fighting both causes at the end.
You write, again, I quote, "In a strict sense, no one would be punished for Lovejoy's death or the destruction of his press, nor of the firebombing of Gilman's warehouse. But that's not fully true." And you argue that Alton itself paid the price for what this mob did to this newspaper man. How so?
Well, Alton in the 1830s had this grand ambition that it was going to usurp St. Louis as the sort of Queen of the West, as the powerhouse on the Mississippi. It had links to the north. It had links to the east. There was a railroad being built, a national highway being built. And Alton had these grand visions of itself as being even a more important hub than St. Louis, which, of course, to St. Louis was ridiculous. St. Louis had long established itself as a big trading post and a major, center for movement, both along the river south, but also to the west, right, to the southwest. After this confrontation, after Lovejoy's killing, after the mob's attack on his presses, and the firebombing of the warehouse where Lovejoy made his last stand, the fate of Alton really fell, and there was already suffering an economic downturn that year. There was it was called the Panic of 1837. It was a widespread economic panic, but it hit Alton very hard and sort of sent it into a downward spiral from which it never really recovered. Some of the leading figures who were in this Lovejoy story ended up leaving Alton. They moved out altogether. Some of his allies, some of his foes, some of the leading characters left. Alton didn't die out. Alton still exists today, but it was never able again to sort of achieve the status that it believed it would have when dreamers in the 1830s envisioned this, new economic powerhouse.
Well, Ken, I just enjoyed this book so much. I cannot recommend this biography more highly. And I'm just very curious, in our last couple minutes, you're not from this area and you are not a trained historian. You're a journalist with a lot of experience. But what got you into this story in particular?
I was teaching after a long career at the LA Times. I was teaching in China at a Chinese university, of all things, at the journalism school at a very progressive Chinese university called Nanjing University. And I introduced the class. I was teaching a class on the history of American journalism. I introduced Lovejoy, just kind of as a throwaway part of a unit on abolitionism and the press. And the reaction that they had to Lovejoy's story just blew me away. I was really surprised at how much impact they seemed to feel from it. They were really moved by his story. And it got me thinking, there's a great story in this. I wonder, what more I can do with it. And I really started digging into the story. And it took, several years of research. On my trips back to the States, I would spend summers in the archives in various places. And from Maine to Illinois, to Ohio, I found a great treasure trove of documents online and at Texas Tech University, and just really dug into it. It's to me, as a journalist and not as a trained historian, but just as a journalist, struck me as just a hell of a story. And I wanted to tell it in a way that we tell stories today.
Well, and you've done that. This book is so good. And Ken Ellingwood, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and sharing just a little bit of the many wonderful details within it.
Well, just thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here. If you learned something new from today's episode, consider leaving us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the easiest way to help people discover our show. We appreciate it. Thank you. St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri, St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.